Now we're going to start back at the top again and go through in a little bit more detail. And as I said, things begin with chewing your food. And here we have the three major types of teeth that are found in the mouth. The incisors are the front teeth, and they are primarily for cutting through food. The canines are the next in line here, and they are for tearing, particularly meat. And then molars, both premolars and regular molars back here, are for grinding the food into smaller pieces. And so you have incisors, canines, and molars. Now, in addition to those things in the mouth, you also have the three major salivary glands, along with many minor accessory salivary glands. You have the parotid gland, which is the largest of these, whose duct comes out through the cheek right around the second molar. You have the submandibular gland here and the sublingual gland. And these three glands produce saliva and secrete that saliva into the mouth, and it's mixed in with the food. Now, an infection that affects these glands is called the mumps. It's actually a viral infection that affects these glands. And then once this is all mixed together and it's ready to go down, the process of deglutition occurs. And deglutition is the act of swallowing. And this diagram shows the three steps in swallowing. The first step is called the voluntary oral phase. In the voluntary oral phase, the person propels the food to the back of the throat by using their tongue. Now, during this time, the esophagus, while they're chewing, is shut off, and the air opening is open, the epiglottis is up, which is why while you're chewing and before you start to swallow, it's important not to speak or take in air, because you can take the food right down into your air path and get choked. And then once this is well chewed up, the tongue propels it to the back, and this is the voluntary part. The next part is called the pharyngeal phase, and this is the part where once the food is propelled to a certain point, a swallowing reflex is triggered. The swallowing reflex pulls the larynx up, and that causes the epiglottis to close down over the airway, and the false vocal cords also shut off, and the sphincter in the esophagus relaxes and allows the food to pass in to the esophagus. Then the muscles relax and all of the process drops down, and then this opens back up and the person begins to breathe again. The last phase is the esophageal phase, which is after the food makes it into the esophagus, the upper pharynx sphincter closes to prevent any food from going back up, and then a peristaltic wave drives the food down into the stomach. And this is a circular contraction that moves in a front down the esophagus, driving the food down into the stomach. And this is the process of swallowing. Now, when we look at the stomach can be divided into four areas. There's the gastric cardia, which is this initial area right by the entrance into the esophagus. There's the fundus of the stomach, the body of the stomach, which is right in here, and the antrum of the stomach. The pylorus is here, and then this first portion of the duodenum, which is the first portion of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum, is here. Now, the pylorus is important because it acts as the gatekeeper to prevent food from going into the duodenum before it's ready. And it controls the flow of material into the duodenum. And there are certain signals, primarily the liquidness of the chyme, that tell the pylorus that food is ready to go into the duodenum. The antrum is important because it's where most of the acid and pepsin is produced. And then the food primarily is chewed up in this area here. Gastric juice, as I said, is primarily secreted by the antrum, and it mixes together with the material in the stomach to continue digestion. Pepsin is the principal enzyme that's in gastric juice. It's actually the product of a proenzyme called pepsinogen, which is broken apart in an acid environment, and then that acts on the proteins to break them down into smaller sections known as peptides. Now this is an up close and personal look at the stomach, the mucosa of the stomach. This is the mucosa part of the stomach here, and you have the fundic glands, which produce the acid and the pepsin. Acid is primarily produced by parietal cells, shown here. The chief cells produce most of the pepsin, and then there are goblet cells which produce the mucus. And then all of this comes out through little holes called gastric pits. The muscularis mucosa is a small muscle layer that separates the mucosa from the muscle layer, and there are three muscle layers. There's the longitudinal muscle layer, the circular muscle layer, and then the oblique muscle layer, and these act together to form the peristaltic wave. And then lastly, the outside part of the stomach is called the serosa. So the gastric pits, as I said, are where the gastric juice comes out of the gastric glands. These are the glands right here, and they produce all of the material that is then extruded into the lumen of the stomach. Now, during the process of contraction, folds will form in this mucosa, and these temporary folds, which come and go, are called gastric rugae. Now, the stomach also produces something called intrinsic factor, and intrinsic factor is an important chemical that helps bind B12 and lead to its absorption. Now this diagram shows intrinsic factor. It's a protein with two subunits, an alpha subunit here and a beta subunit here, and in the middle is the B12 is bound in the middle. And B12 also has cobalt as part of its structure. Now the outside of the stomach is something called the adventitia, and the adventitia is a connective tissue area that binds one organ to its surrounding structures and sort of helps keep it oriented in space where it is supposed to be. But this is ultimately absorbed in the last part of the small intestine and allows for the absorption of B12. And people who do not make intrinsic factor cannot absorb B12 and develop anemia because of that. Gastrin is a hormone that's produced by the pancreas, and it signals the stomach to produce acid. So gastrin is a local hormone produced by the pancreas, and it acts on the stomach to tell the stomach to produce acid and gastric juice. Moving on to the small intestine is made up of three units, or three parts. Once you go through the pylorus, there's this sweep here that's called the duodenum. Now the duodenum is primarily responsible for neutralizing the acid that comes out of the stomach and also continuing the digestive process. Bile comes into the duodenum as does the pancreatic secretions. And then once it crosses a landmark known as the ligament of Treitz, it's in the jejunum. The jejunum is important because the jejunum is where much of the intestinal absorption occurs. And then the last part of the intestine is called the ileum, and the ileum absorbs certain nutrients. One of the things the ileum absorbs, as I said before, is B12 that's bound to intrinsic factor. And then the ileum dumps into the first portion of the colon, which is called the cecum. This is called a mesentery. A mesentery is just a connective tissue that connects to all of the small intestine and again holds it oriented in space. The small intestine is extremely long. It's not something that you can actually measure because it's a muscular tube and it can change its length based on whether the muscles are contracting or not. But it's felt to be several feet long. The circular folds that are inside the intestine increase the surface area for absorption. And then further increasing the surface area is the intestinal villi. So everything about the small intestine is built for maximizing the ability to absorb the nutrients that are taken into the body. You have a very long intestine, which allows for a great deal of contact, and then two different things act together to increase the surface area by a great deal. Remember, when we were talking about the respiratory system, one of the reasons that the lungs had alveoli was also to increase the surface area for exchange. So here we have the lumen of the small bowel. The lumen, to point out here, first of all, you have this central area that's a lymphatic vessel. This is called a lacteal. And the central lacteal is important in the absorption of fats. And this lacteal is where fat, once it's been absorbed, ends up going. The lumen of the bowel, which is the space in the center of the tube, is where all the material is. And in the proximal part, in the duodenum, the intestine secretes something called secretin, and secretin tells the pancreas to add its digestive juices to the mix. And we'll talk about what the pancreas produces in just a minute. The proximal small intestine, or the duodenum, also produces a hormone called cholecystokinin. Cholecystokinin is important because it tells the gallbladder to contract. So when you take in a fat meal, when the fat hits this part of the small intestine, the duodenal part of the small intestine, it produces cholecystokinin, or CCK. That hormone goes up and tells the gallbladder, and the gallbladder contracts, and bile is then brought down to help digest the fat. Now, I won't say much about all the various enzymes in the small intestine that act to help with digestion. I will mention one, though, and that's lactase. And the reason I mention it is it's important in a problem known as lactose intolerance. In a normal person, their lactose, which is milk sugar, and is in most milk products, lactose is a two-molecule disaccharide. Lactase breaks this in half, and then the two molecules, a glucose and a galactose, are then absorbed into the body. And because it's absorbed into the body, this lactose does not make it to this large bowel. Now, people who don't have the lactase is not absorbed. It moves on into the large bowel, and there are bacteria that ferment this and produce both gas and acids. And because of this, people with lactose intolerance have bloating, gas, they pass a lot of gas if they drink, they get diarrhea and abdominal pain. Lactose intolerance occurs in about 15% of people, Caucasians in the United States. It's virtually ubiquitous. That is, almost 100% of Chinese people in Asia have lactose intolerance, and a fairly large percentage of black people from Africa. Now, talking about the large bowel is broken down into four sections. There's the cecum, which is here, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and the sigmoid colon. The principal job, as I said before, of the colon is to reabsorb water. The colon has a huge number of bacteria. 1 times 10 to the 14th, or 100 trillion bacteria that weigh about 3 pounds live in the colon, which is why if the integrity of the colon is lost, infections occur. The most common way that the colon moves things through the body is by what's known as mass movement, which is there's a large wave that just moves a big front of whatever's in the colon along toward the rectum. And this is one of the reasons why people can be usually fairly normal, and then all of a sudden they get a tremendous urge to go to the restroom. Now, once the person goes to the, once the material is moved to the rectum, distension of the rectum causes what's known as the defecation reflex. And this is triggered and tells the body that it's time to go. Now, the internal sphincter, which is right in this area, relaxes, but fortunately we have an external sphincter, which is voluntary, that we can hold it until we can get to an appropriate place to let things go. This puborectalis muscle is also quite important because when it contracts, it kinks this off much like a hose, and it helps prevent from undesirable events.